Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. I've been reading my next guest since high school, and I was delighted to get a copy of Plow Publishing, has a new collection of some essays called Jesus Changes Everything, A New World Made Possible, Stanley Hauerwas, edited by Charles Moore, and with an introduction from our friend Tish Harrison Warren. And most of you, I think, listening to this will be familiar with Stanley Hauerwas's work. He, of course, has been at Duke Divinity School for years and years and years, has written umpteen books. I couldn't even begin to count how many books he has written, and been right at the center of the conversation in American life for a long time. Almost no one introduces Stanley Hauerwas without mentioning that in 2001, Time magazine named him the best theologian in America, to which he said, best is not a theological category, which I loved. And so, Stanley Hauerwas, thanks for joining us today.
It's lovely to be with you, Russell.
You know, you had said at one point that one of your fundamental convictions is that Christian language works. Don't seem to be working, does it? Right now.
It depends on where you think you're talking about, where it's working and not working. It's working clearly in Africa. And it's our sense of limit of where we are that we think it's not working. It only takes two or three. And I think that those two or three are alive and well among us. Dorothy Day was among us, the people that are finding one another today. Isn't making big headlines, but it is suggesting that all is not lost. I do think Christianity is a vocabulary, and we haven't done well with our vocabulary. And now I think we're recovering slowly but surely people who know when they say Jesus is Lord, they're saying something very significant.
What did your home church do right to prompt you to start asking the kinds of questions that you spent the rest of your life answering?
I don't have any idea. My home church was Pleasant Mound United Methodist Church in Pleasant Grove, Texas. And we were a sad, not very impressive lot. But I learned the hymns of Charles Wesley there. And Brown hymnal with shape notes that made me think that this stuff might matter. Yeah, I when people say, why did you become a theologian? I say, it's the only way I knew to be saved. I grew up in the church where there were dedications to the ministry by the youth. And I thought I didn't want to do that. But me, Pleasant Mound, you could be baptized on Sunday morning, but you had to be saved on Sunday night. The sermon had to be at least 45 minutes. And I wanted to be saved, but it just didn't happen.
Hmm.
And finally, one Sunday night, we were singing I Surrender All for the 25th time at the altar call. You know all this, Russell. You've
Oh,
been
yeah.
through it. And I thought, if something doesn't happen, this is going to go on all night. So I went up and dedicated my life to the Lord, not having any idea what that would mean.
Hmm.
But people thought it meant that I was going into ministry. So we had an associate minister who told me I needed to read books. So I read a lot of very bad books. But I hit upon B. David Napier's From Faith to Faith, which was an Old Testament scholar. And through that, I discovered that the Bible wasn't true. And Nils F.S. Ferre's The Sun in the Umbrella, which suggested that religion probably hid God as much as it revealed God. And I thought, well, that's probably right. So I gave it up, but I was already on my way to college. No one in my family had ever been to college. And there, I was the philosophy major at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. And reading Copleston's history, I slowly thought that I wasn't smart enough to be an atheist. So I decided that I should go to divinity school to find out if the stuff is true or not. I went to Yale Divinity School, read Karl Barth, and the rest is history.
Hmm.
So that's how, in a short way, the story went.
How did you decide to stay a Methodist rather than to become something else?
Because I was convinced that John and Charles Wesley were recovering evangelical Christianity in a Catholic context. And I thought that was the way forward for Christianity. Of course, I've been a member or communicant at the Church of the Holy Family, an Episcopal church in Chapel Hill now for over 20 years. I say it's God's little joke on me after all the years of getting people about me, Episcopalians. I'm one.
I think about, you mentioned Karl Barth. I think about a quote all the time that Frederick Buechner used to give from Barth about that moment when the preacher gets behind the desk, and for just a little moment, the congregation is wondering, is he going to tell us how to know if this is true? And I think about that often. What convinced you that the Christian story is actually true?
that a Karl Barth existed, that a Dietrich Bonhoeffer existed, that there were witnesses that were incoherent if what happened in Christ on the cross hadn't happened.
Hmm.
So I suppose I also think that being a Christian is the most interesting thing that could possibly happen to you, because I think that creation is revealed in a first century Palestinian Jew. What could be more extraordinarily interesting than that event and what it means for how one lives one's life? What, as I often say, I'm a very simple Christian. I believe what I see it tells me to believe, and that that's an extraordinary uh, thing to have happen to anyone through the everyday lives of everyday Christians.
Sometimes I wonder, is it that we don't have many saints now, or is it that in the eras of the saints, we just didn't have the internet? Did we not know as much about people as we know now? And I think there are a lot of people who, when they look at some of their heroes and they see a lack of character, scandal, those kinds of things that we've seen kind of over and over and over again. You have written a lot about character formation and holiness and so forth. And I wonder how much should we expect to see in terms of transformation of life, kind of those Dorothy days and people, and how much are we just too idealistic about what can change about human nature?
I think at the heart of it is friendship and the kind of lives that we live as Christians make possible our friendships with others in a way that makes us non heroic, but filled with the joy of knowing that we're not alone
Hmm.
and that therefore, I mean, who can who can be more realistic than Christians about our limits? The the saints continue to testify that they're just barely making it through, and they do that with great honesty and articulate confession of sin. So uh, I think it's, it's hard to be a Christian that takes oneself too seriously
Hmm.
and instead is possessed by joy.
You mentioned Bonhoeffer a few minutes ago. Have you seen the new Bonhoeffer movie?
I've, I've just seen snatches of it.
Uh-huh. What do you think of the way Bonhoeffer is portrayed in the imagination today? I can't imagine, as a committed pacifist, that you would like some of that framing.
I don't like it at all. One, they make him a hero because they think he wanted to assassinate Hitler, which I think, as Mark Nation has shown, we can't substantiate that. Secondly, I think that because of his heroism in resisting the Nazis, people overlooked the fact that he was one great theologian. I think I think his early book, Sectorium Communio, is a work of great theological imagination that freed the church from Crouch.
Hmm.
That was a great achievement, and people don't give it appropriate credit.
Hmm. I was just rereading recently, and I'm sure you've referenced this before. I can't remember, but when Bart said that under Hitler, the church needed to preach as though nothing had happened. And there were a lot of people who suggested that what he meant by that is just ignore all of this injustice and atrocity, which is, of course, is the opposite of what he meant. What he meant was, don't let this authoritarian state take over the witness of the church. Preach as though
Right.
nothing ever happened. What do you think some of the lessons are that we ought to pick up from those few people who seemed to know exactly what was going on at the time?
Well, you don't let Hitler determine your agenda. You don't let your imagination be seized by those who seem to use the means of violence and power to uh, create a life that seems meaningful. I mean, great power of the totalitarian is they can seize our lives in a way that seems to give those lives purpose in a world without purpose.
Hmm.
And that is to be resisted by going the way of the Bruderhof.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that we all need to be Bruderhof, but it does mean that they represent a way forward that we desperately need.
For people who don't know who the Bruderhof are, this is an Anabaptist community. It's kind of I describe them as sort of like Amish with Wi-Fi. It's a technologically very savvy group of people, but they do live together in community, and they defied Hitler and escaped from Hitler. How does someone do that in the kind of American society right now, where if we're going to put into effect community resident alienation that you have written about, that kind of contradictory Christian grammar, when it seems as though it's almost impossible to hold attention, to have communities, like your home church and my home church in a kind of hypermobile sort of American life, very difficult to do. Nobody would be together on a Sunday night now. So how would somebody start to do something different?
By telling the truth.
Hmm.
I mean, a truthful people. I preached Holy at Holy Family a few months ago, and I began the sermon because it's true. We're here because it's true, and that's what it seems to me that the church should demand from those with the authority to preach because it's true, and we take no we take no prisoners in that. We want those in front of us to want to know the truth, and that becomes um, one of the things that hopefully would attract people to being together to worship God. Culturally, we're in a time when we just simply have to be patient. And I think that we have to be patient because as Christians, we've done such a terrible job of reproducing the vocabulary, as we said at the beginning, and what reproducing the vocabulary means for how we live our lives. I blame a lot of this, Russell, on the Southern Baptists. I
How
grew up
so?
in, I grew up in a community where Pleasant Grove Baptist was, of course, the cathedral church in the town. And that meant they were primarily against dancing in high school, which which I'm sure you understand.
I do.
And um, I say the Southern Baptists are the first free church tradition that created its own civilization. It's called the South.
Hmm.
And we as Christians imitated the Southern Baptists in all kinds of ways of trying to produce a world in which you didn't have to make much of a decision to be a Christian. It just came with the drinking water.
Hmm.
Now, now, God may well be steering us in a way that we will have to take our lives seriously enough to, to see that being Christian is not an everyday affair.
I can't help but think of a line that you had in your autobiography about moving from Texas to the South proper,
Right.
and saying there's nothing crueler than Southern civility. I suppose that's part of that civilization we
That's,
we
that's right.
built here.
Of course, I came from working class,
Mm.
and uh, in the working class were good people, but they weren't necessarily civil. When you're laying brick, uh, you don't exactly say, "Could you pass me a brick?" So it's a very different world.
What with when you say the Christian vocabulary that we've lost it, do you mean that the words have become so familiarized and the stories have become so routinized that we don't hear them or that we don't tell them?
I think we don't hear them because we don't know them. Uh, that the vocabulary, for example, the vocabulary of grace is oftentimes becomes an abstraction of "you're okay, I'm okay," without any uh, determination by the fact that grace is God refused to abandon us in Christ. So, I mean, the heart of when I say I'm a simple believer, I mean that the particularity of our convictions are irreplaceable. We don't have a general view about, well, it's so important that God exists. What's important is that the Trinity that creates what we say is existence means that we are all taken up in a way of life that is not easily accepted because it's going to challenge our assumption that we exist and our existence is more important than God Himself.
Hmm.
So it's a very, very simple set of convictions, but
It,
I'm sorry, it makes all the difference.
and that's why I assume that you have been so insistent about um, resisting the therapeutic direction of preaching and pastoral care and life of the church.
That's right. That it's not that I'm against you caring for someone who is contemplating suicide, but God has given us space to say, let us offer you a way of life that will take time for you to enjoy what God has given us to do in a world that's deeply antithetical to what God has given us to do.
It's hard, though, to recuperate that Christian vocabulary when we're in a time when, if you just look at maybe the two big sectors of American Protestantism, quoting the Sermon on the Mount could get you kicked out of evangelicalism, and saying the Lord's Prayer could get you kicked out of mainline Protestantism. The vocabulary seems to be out of step in different ways, but out of step in some cases for the same reasons, because of a ethical, political sort of commitment that seems to be central. And there are a lot of people, I hear from a lot of our listeners who are saying, what do I do when I'm in a community where the only options that I have are places that are kind of means to an end Christianity of some sort or the other?
One of the things I've become aware of in the last years of my life is I don't know dip about evangelical Christianity. I mean, though I'm come from working class, I come out of the main line. Methodism is the main line. Um, I, I, I don't know. I tend to think of it as big box churches. I don't know big box churches that have couches where the table used to be.
Hmm.
I find that kind of Christianity, I almost want to say the word distasteful, but it's there, and there's some good happening in some of it, uh, but I I I don't think they'll ever hold the kids and
Mm.
how to be committed to a Christianity that takes a lifetime to learn is part of the challenge before us. And I just think it's going to, it takes, I admire the kind of things you're able to do, Russell, in these podcasts. I mean, to have people like David Brooks on is, I think, a place to start. I regard him as an 18th century moralist
Mm.
whose insights are about the transformation of our lives in ways that make uh, us not be susceptible to too easy accounts of what it means to be a good person. Uh,
Mm.
so that's a small dip in the water, but
Mm.
it's that someone like Brooks is still there makes a
Hmm.
big difference.
What do you think about the split of Methodism? Does that tell us anything about sort of where the church is going, or is it just unique to Methodism? It seems to be similar to what's happening in multiple denominations all at once.
Well, I say that Methodism, unlike the Episcopalians, are not organized well enough to split. They'll just crumble. Uh, the uh, the Methodists are organized well enough to split because of the ministerial education fund that funds retirement for Methodist ministers. So it's not clear that crucial theological issues like gays, same-sex marriage that's splitting the church. Why couldn't uh, the Methodist support of war and split the church? That would have been more interesting. Uh, but I wonder what happened that something like same-sex marriage became the issue before the church. And what is so disappointing is you can't get to the issues that would make you know what you're talking about when you talk about the problems with same-sex marriage. Why didn't we talk about divorce and marriage much before same-sex marriage came up? If we knew what we meant by marriage, we might not be so uh, concerned about same-sex marriage because I say, do you want to promise lifelong monogamous fidelity as marriage? Of course we do, but we haven't been very good at knowing how to do that. So,
But but it is hard to imagine how people could stay together when maybe there's a I could hear a progressive Methodist who is saying this is a civil rights issue and you're not recognizing me if you don't affirm this, and people who as I do, hold to a more traditional Christian sexual ethic, would say you can't undo the icon of Christ in the church and give up Catholicity for something the church never even contemplated till 15 minutes ago. It seems like those are really irreconcilable kinds of positions if you have to decide who's going to be officiating at marriages and determining what's repentance and church membership, right?
But the marriage question isn't a civil rights issue. I mean, that's already getting off on the wrong foot.
Well, I would say that they would argue it's a justice issue, that people aren't accepting that sort of a bigotry issue.
I
They would
think
say.
that's also a mistake.
Hmm.
It's not a justice issue. It is a question. I mean, first of all, Christians don't have to be married to be Christian. I mean, one of the most extraordinarily differences of the early church was you didn't have to have a child to be a Christian. So you can be sure that Christians are embarrassed about being Christians when they think that the only way to make a Christian is to have them as a child. And they've lost, therefore, the need for witness. The church grows by witness and conversion, not through biological ascription. Though we depended upon biological ascription for a long time. And that's one of the reasons we've gotten in such trouble, is we can't figure out why anyone would be called to marriage as part of the witness internal to the gospel. And singleness becomes the alternative. When gay people first started making themselves known, I thought that being able to discuss what kind of people you need to be to have single people in the church in a way that they do not become just lonely individuals is part of the challenge, would be part of the challenge of us becoming a more interesting people. The gay issue lacked a context for reframing questions about what status they have. Obviously, they're Christians. And my own position is that, and I think I share your views about these matters, but my own position is, okay, we Christians have had 2,000 years of trying to figure out how marriage works, and we haven't done very well with it. Gay people today say they want to be married. How extraordinary. Most people today don't want to be married. Let's see how they do. We haven't done too well as heterosexuals. Maybe they will do better as homosexuals in marriage.
Well, but you wouldn't say that about other aspects of revealed truth about the call to holiness. I mean, think for instance of the call to peace. I don't think you would say we've had 2,000 years of war, so
Yeah.
let's just let it
No.
happen.
No, I'm obviously being too clever,
Yeah.
but it's a way to try to challenge our imaginations to start thinking in a way that is determined by our more fundamental convictions and the wider society's view that basically lets romantic marriage language determine our understandings of marriage.
You talk about in a chapter in this Jesus Changes Everything book, when you're talking about fidelity, and you challenge the idea of falling in love, marrying, and sort of reverse that, and say the call to fidelity comes first, and the love grows out of that over time. That's a really hard image to reverse. How does somebody think that through in preparing for marriage when all they've ever seen is kind of the traditional romantic sort of idealization of what marriage should be?
You're a pastor. You would know better how to do that than I am. I'm a layperson. But it has to do with story and how people understand their lives as narrated by Christ, and how those narrations uh, are joined in a couple in marriage. And I would think pastoral counseling would at least suggest some of those challenges before those that feel called to witness as Christians to marriage. Uh, it's a it's a big challenge today, I would say.
Well, and we may well be, God forbid, on the precipice of World War III, for all we know. You've been very clear about your views on war and about your views on peace and on peacemaking. For Christians who not all agree, I mean, I'm not even talking about for pacifists. I'm not a pacifist, but for all of us, how should we start thinking about a different way when we may well be in some awful warlike times ahead? And I hope I'm wrong.
Well, one, we ought to, anyone that is joining the military, and I try to be very clear that the position I'm taking is not one that blames those that are going into the military as being uh, immoral or unchristian in what they're doing. Indeed, I wish that those of us who represent the nonviolent alternative within Christianity could be at least as serious as people going into the military. But if you're going into the military, I think at least they have to know well just war and how you think about just war in terms of the criteria that have been developed by people like Paul Ramsey. And that, my bottom line is, if, if, if a war is not just, what is it? Uh, we, we continue to use the honorific language of war. Uh, it, if, even if the war is not just, it's war. And we think, therefore, that it's justified. But why was World War I and World War II called war? They were not just wars. They were slaughters. Why don't you call them World Slaughter II or World Slaughter I? I'm making these kinds of comments as a way to suggest what it means for congregations to recover serious Christian doubts about war within the just war context. Because without doing that, then war just becomes an option that makes it possible for people to be celebrated, to kill in a way that does them no good. These are
What
these are
about,
extraordinarily serious matters
yeah?
that we haven't even begun to approach.
What about for people who, I mean, I believe World War II was a just war and was the right thing to do.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
No, not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the war itself. For somebody who does believe there is a category for a just war, in a time like this, how do you know if what's happening is just or unjust? When I mean, we're kind of in a fog of information now, and it may well be that that something happens. People don't even really know what morally is happening, much less how to think about it. How do you
Well,
start doing that?
you take the war in the Ukraine. I would, people, people don't ask me for foreign policy. It's very not clear to me why, but I'm not thought of as someone to do that. But if you want to know what I would have thought I would have done in the Ukraine,
Hmm,
is I would have let the Russians roll over me,
hmm,
and then I would make it difficult for them to rule. I mean, there's nothing quite as as interesting as trying to withhold consent from a totalitarian takeover. And it's not, takes a lot of courage, but it does happen. I'm not at all uh, uh, convinced or assured that my presumption that it would be possible for the Ukrainians to mount a resistance. Uh, I may be able to do that and talk that way because I'm not Ukrainian. But uh, surely, Russell, there is, I mean, the Southern Baptist churches have the American flag oftentimes in the chancel.
hmm
I mean, that's not a good way to start trying to think about war because where we are hallowed by the sacrifice of the men and women that died in the wars in the past, and their names are in the back of the church, and the flag is in the chancel. That's the sacrifice that we think binds us as Christians. And therefore, the sacrifice of the altar is not seen as central or any sacrifice we name. So, I have a little book called War and the American Difference. And, and in it, I have a chapter in which I suggest that war is a event that is liturgical, and we keep looking for ways to reproduce it as liturgy requires. And what we have to think about a war is how it may not let us see that the true sacrifice is on the altar where we are made part of the body and blood of Christ for the world.
There are a lot of pastors, I think, who would say, I really do want my people to identify themselves first with the kingdom of God. I'm trying to get them there, and I'm trying to figure out how to preach in such a way that is to say the difference that you make in this book, in one of the essays in this book, the difference between truth and candor. Candor, just saying whatever is is correct, but not necessarily the loving way to do it. How should one preach in a way that is patient and truthful at the same time without being cowardly or laying burdens on people they're not ready for?
Have the right examples. I think exemplification is absolutely crucial. And the history of the church is full of wonderful examples. Pastor, first of all, needs to be loved by the people that he's preaching to. And that takes time. So Jesus wanted us to be disciples, but he didn't want us to be stupid. And it's be stupid to think that you go after questions of war right off the bat before people have learned to see that you pay prices for what it is you're going to say.
Imagine we're going back in time to that Sunday night when you're dedicating your life to Christ, and you've got a word of advice to give to that young Stanley Hauerwas on his way out into the world. What would you tell him?
Read books.
Hmm.
I think reading is a form of moral formation that, as Christians, we depend upon people reproducing either for themselves or for others. And I know that seems extremely odd to give that kind of advice, but it's reading has shaped my life. And I don't think I could be who I am without it.
Hmm.
Then, secondly, friendship means so much. And through friends, we are able to have some protection against self-deception. Self-deception is always right around the corner. I mean, you and I try to be serious Christians, but we live very well. And it's not clear we paid the price to know what that means. It's not at all clear to me. We know what it looks like to be a Christian today. And we need to be honest and upfront about that. And to do that, we need friends who will tell us who we are.
Well, speaking of reading, one of the things we like to do at the end is to imagine you're going to be on a desert island for the rest of your life, and you can choose 5 books of the Bible only to take with you. What would Stanley Hauerwas's 5 be?
Genesis, Exodus. I'm a big fan of Leviticus, but Matthew and John.
You may be the only person so far who's even contemplated Leviticus, so I'm excited to I'm excited to have that there. The book is called "Jesus Changes Everything: A New World Made Possible." Essays by Stanley Hauerwas. Thank you, sir, for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Will Dawson. The associate producer is Mackenzie Hill. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris with video production by Abby Egan. Theme music by Lennon Hutton. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.